lecture series for ethics. In this video, we're going to conclude our discussion of Epictetus' Enchiridion, which you'll remember is a sort of general handbook or guideline for living the Stoic philosophy and explaining how one ought to live one's life. And as we saw last time, one of the major claims that Epictetus wants to make in the Enchiridion is that we have no reason, in fact, we're living our life incorrectly if we pursue external goods. So what is an external good? Well, as we saw coming from Aristotle, an external good is something like wealth or power or influence or children or friends, right? Really, it's any sort of good that is outside of our moral character. Now, in Aristotle, we saw a more balanced view. He says the primary component of human happiness is the development of one's character, of virtue, which is the good of the soul. And while this is the primary and most important part of our happiness, he also says, however, we do need some external goods. No person can be completely happy and functioning well and flourishing if they don't have the resources to put their plans in action. And we'd also say that no one's really flourishing as a human being if they suffer too many tragedies and misfortunes. And this means for Aristotle that at least to some extent, it is the case that our happiness and flourishing is not completely within our control. And it is just this point that Epictetus and the other Stoic philosophers criticize Aristotle on. In fact, they say we have no reason to pursue external goods, and to the extent that we do pursue external goods, we're only going to be left with disappointment, and we're only going to be left in a situation where we are not living freely. If we pursue external goods, we're pursuing things that are not within our control. The only things we control are what we think, what we believe, and what we desire. So I suggested to you also last time that not only do the Stoics think that rejecting external goods and only focusing on desiring the right things and believing the right things will make you free, but it's also what makes your life go well. To put it in Aristotelian terminology, the Stoics would say that this is what constitutes eudaimonia. Eudaimonia is believing and desiring the right things. And in this video, I want to delve into that a little further and ask, how does this very sort of radical philosophy, and it is radical, I mean, Aristotle in a sense was radical enough, saying that happiness is truly about character. But this goes even a step further, because if you think about, for the vast majority of individuals, what is it that we concern ourselves with on a day-to-day basis? Well, external goods. The acquisition of wealth, right, attaining a certain job, caring for our friends and family, all these are external goods. And given that these are at the forefront of our mind, Aristotle's claim that character and virtue is the primary component of happiness is radical enough. And so the Stoic claim that external goods don't matter at all even takes it a step further. So we should really wonder, how is it that living a life of this sort will make me happy, that will contribute to my well-being? And that's what we're going to look at in this video. So to begin, I want to go back to the Enchiridion, and I want to look at section 2 of the Enchiridion, where Epictetus gives us another argument for why we should not pursue external goods. So here's the passage I have in mind. He says, "Remember that desire demands the attainment of that which you are desirous." So it's just in the nature of a desire, whether it's to have friends or to have a certain job or to have wealth, that what a desire is a sort of demand or call for whatever thing it is that you want. And aversion demands the avoidance of that to which you are averse. So we all have desires, we have things we want, and we all have aversions. You may not be as familiar with the word aversion, but it's just the flip side of desire. Right? Desires are things you want, aversions are things you want to avoid. Okay, so we have these things, desires and aversions. And Epictetus continues to say, "He who fails of that object of his desires is disappointed. And he who incurs the object of his aversion is wretched." Okay, so we all have desires and we all have aversions. And he makes a claim about what it means or what happens when our desires or our aversions are not fulfilled the way we want to. So he says, if you desire something and you don't get it, you'll be disappointed. And this seems pretty reasonable, right? This is sort of a straightforward claim. If you want to go to a certain restaurant, but you're overruled with a group of friends who want to go somewhere else, you'll feel disappointed that you didn't get to go where you want to go. If you don't get the career opportunity you've been working for a long, long time, you'll have feelings of disappointment. If the object of your affection ultimately decides that they don't feel the same way about you, can be an utter and deep disappointment. So that seems straightforward, but notice what he says about aversion. He says, he who incurs the object of his aversion is wretched. So what he's saying here is that if you are averse to something, if there's something you want to avoid, but that thing happens to you anyway, you get fired from your job, right? You get dumped by your significant other, you're forced to go to a restaurant you don't want to go to. When something happens that you want to avoid, then he says you are wretched. And we might wonder, well, why is this? That seems like a bit of an extreme sort of claim there. But I think the idea is this. If you're in a situation where you cannot avoid having things happen to you that you don't want to happen to you, then you're in a position where, as we talked about last time, you lack control over your life, you're powerless, right? You don't have the ability or power to avoid the things you want to avoid. And someone who's weak, dependent, and powerless, another way we might think about that is this is a wretched individual. They can't stand up for themselves and avoid having those bad things happen to them that they don't want to have happen to them. So this is what he means, right? So we all have desires, we all have aversions, we all have things we want, we all have things we avoid. And when we fail to get the things we want, we're disappointed. When we can't avoid that which we want to avoid, we're powerless and we're wretched. So we can sort of see where he's going here, and based on that initial statement, I have this outline of the argument I think he's making here. So P1, the person who is averse to what is not in their power to avoid is wretched. The person who desires what's not in their power to obtain will be disappointed. So remember, this tells you something important about what we should be averse to and what we should desire. If you're averse to getting fired from your job, if you desire to get a certain job, both of those are external goods. They fall under what Epictetus told us are not under our control. And the same if you want to avoid illness and you want to attain health, not under our control. If you want to avoid dying and you want to continue living, not under our control. When and how and exactly what happens and occurs when we die. So given these claims, he adds a third claim, which I'm outlining in the following way. It is not in our power to avoid sickness, death, or poverty, right? You can't have fundamental control over the amount of wealth you have or your health or when you die, nor is it in our power to obtain the opposites, health, immortality, and wealth. And it's interesting that, as he explains here, the opposite of death, of course, is immortality, right? And we'll get into this in a little bit, but there really is no more fundamental or common aversion than death. Many people have seen death and our fear and anxiety towards it as a sort of ordering principle of our lives, right? It's a sense in which all the projects we undergo, all the aims that we aim for, our desire to leave a legacy after we die is a way of sort of trying to deal with our anxiety about death and the fact that one day we will not exist. So what's interesting putting those in opposition, however, was you don't normally think of wanting to avoid death as wanting to desire immortality. We just sort of think, well, I'd rather not die, I want to continue living. But of course, to truly deny death in the most fundamental sense means that you would then be grasping for, desiring immortality, which, as Epictetus tells us, is not something which is within our control. So if we put all these claims together, we get the following. If you are averse to sickness, death, or poverty, if you want to avoid those things, and if you desire their opposites, health, immortality, or wealth, you're going to be both actually wretched and disappointed. You're going to be wretched because you won't be able to avoid those things, and disappointed because you will never be able to finally and securely achieve health, immortality, or wealth. It's not within your control. And given that we don't want to live our lives as wretched or disappointed beings, then the final conclusion he draws in C2, one should not be averse to sickness, death, or poverty. You shouldn't want to avoid those things, and you shouldn't desire their opposites. As we've seen last time, this is another way of arguing based on the nature of desire and aversion, that the way to live our life is not to pursue external goods, but to limit our desire for them, to take our focus away from them. Now, of course, I think this argument brings out a further question you should really have at this point is, Epictetus has told us a lot about what not to do. We shouldn't desire external goods, and he said the key to freedom is desiring the right sorts of things. Well, so keep in mind this question, what exactly are we supposed to be desiring? What should we be believing? Since this is the locus of our freedom and the locus of our well-being. So we'll keep that in mind as we proceed. So, and of course, this is precisely the sort of thing we begin to get an answer to as we begin to look at Enchiridion section 3. So when we ask ourselves, well, what should we desire? How is it that we go about rejecting external goods? What does that look like? He has the following passage here which begins to give you a picture of how we ought to live. And it's really a striking passage when you put the two claims in it next to each other. So in Enchiridion section 3 says, with regard to whatever objects either delight the mind or contribute to use or are tenderly beloved, remind yourself of what nature they are, beginning with the merest trifles. So you say, okay, I'm on board, Epictetus. I'm ready to begin rejecting external goods. How should I do this? What do I need to do? Well, he says, start with small things and remind yourself of what nature they are. So he says, if you have a favorite cup, keep in mind it's but a cup of which you are fond of. And, if it gets broken, you can bear it. So, and we see this happen all the time, right? There's the phrase, don't cry over spilled milk. And, it's an instructive phrase because you probably very much have times in your life where you've noticed yourself becoming anxious or overly invested or worried about small things that aren't really that big of a deal. And so the first thing that Epictetus tells us is, start with small things and say, look, this fact that this cup was broken is my favorite cup. Why do I care about this? Why is it so important to me that this cup is broken? Don't I have other cups? Did I imagine that this cup was indestructible? Of course not. It's a material thing. All material things break down. I knew it was inevitable that one day this cup would break. So why is it so troubling to me? Why is it so anxiety-provoking to me that this favorite cup has in fact been broken? Well, the important word there is favorite. It's only because of what I invested, the value, maybe the sentimental value I invested in that cup. It's only that which is making this anxiety-provoking to me. And so if you remind yourself of what nature this thing is, that it's just a material object that you knew would in fact break one day, and the only importance it has is because you desire it so much, then you begin to go through the process of saying, well, if I change my desire, if I change the value I put on the cup, I can get rid of the anxiety. And when you read a passage like that, it at least strikes me as profoundly right and profoundly wise, and something you should honestly probably keep in mind as you go about your day-to-day business. Because things like this will happen all the time. Okay, so he says, and when we start with something small like that, it makes sense, right? We can see how we could do that. Yeah, I'm putting too much value in this cup, but look at how he continues with the next part of that passage. So now we've done this with something small, let's do something bigger. If you embrace your child or your wife, that you embrace a mortal, and thus if either of them dies, you can bear it. Well, this seems to have taken the whole conversation up a notch. Previously, he was saying, look, if a cup breaks, you can bear it. And that seems right. But now we're talking about a sort of fundamental social and human connection that you have with another human being, human beings that are members of your family. So if a person is a child or wife that dies, you could go through the same process you went through with the cup. You could say, look, okay, I have to remind myself a couple of things. First, these individuals, my child or my wife, these are mortal human beings. I knew that one day they would die. I knew that all human beings die, that this is just a fact of life. So why is it so anxiety-provoking, so troubling, disappointing to me now that they have in fact died? I always knew this was going to happen. And so then you say to yourself, well, why is the occurrence that I knew was going to happen, why is that occurrence now so troubling to me? Well, it's only because of the importance I've placed on these individuals and the extent to which I allowed them to be part of my identity. Just as maybe with the cup, there's a certain sentimental value that I've given to the object. So there's a certain sort of familial value of love that I've given to these individuals, and the fact that they're part of my family I've allowed to become part of my identity. But if I just let that go, if I just let go of the idea that there's a certain sort of unshakable desire I have for the good and continued life of my family members, if I just let that go, then there would be no reason this would be troubling to me. No reason this would be disappointing or anxiety-provoking or saddening or grief-inducing or anything like that. Now notice what I've just done here. I've gone through the same analysis with the cup that I went through with the family member. And I think there's a certain sense in which many people's reaction would be, yeah, it makes sense with the cup, but there's something profoundly troubling and disturbing when you do that with a family member. And I think this is one point where, although I think the Stoics have much to offer in terms of really reorienting our point of view and helping us to really think about what's important in our lives, I think there's also a sense in which Stoicism taken too far can sort of strip life of its meaning. Because one thing to ask yourself is this question: can life be meaningful if you aren't fundamentally and wholly invested in some project? If you're not fundamentally or wholly invested in some sort of pursuit? What we start with Aristotle is that a meaningful and flourishing human life is one where you are pursuing after something which he called happiness or eudaimonia or human flourishing. And you see this as the purpose of your life. And your happiness, you understand, can hinge on whether you're successful or unsuccessful in that endeavor. And you may very well not succeed. And you might think that maybe Aristotle had something right here. Maybe what makes our lives meaningful is the fact that we engage in various projects, whether professional, whether having to do with our family or our friends, whether religious in nature, whether political in nature, whether social in nature. Perhaps it is the case that what makes our lives meaningful is that we engage and invest our identity in certain projects and work to see that they succeed. And of course, you can't invest your identity in a project if you don't care about whether it succeeds or not. If what orients your life and what makes your life meaningful is the flourishing of your family, the certain religious, political, or moral ideals that you hold very dear, if that's what makes your life meaningful, but then your pursuit of those ends fails, then you can't say that you are really invested in those things. If it fails, then you don't care about it. But of course, this is precisely what Epictetus is telling us. He's saying, look, when you're thinking about what you want to happen and what you want to avoid, you shouldn't be concerned with external goods beyond your control. And so this is why I'm saying, if your child dies, your wife dies, you always knew they could die, you can learn to bear it. But maybe there's just something simply inhuman about that. If you think about someone whose child or wife or spouse died and they were immediately okay with it because they reminded themselves that these were mortal beings that always would die, we might look at that as a fundamentally disturbed and inhuman person who simply doesn't understand what a proper human life is all about. So I bring this up as a question for your consideration because I think there's a lot to Stoicism, but I think on this point the rubber hits the road a little bit. We might wonder whether the life that Epictetus is recommending is really one that's meaningful and proper for a human being to live. Okay. Now, in any case, right, we said so in this passage he essentially says the same sort of thing about death, just as the same attitude you should have toward the death of a family member, knowing that, of course, it is inevitable. You should have the same attitude toward your own death. But I want to sort of bring all these points to a head, and I think I told you I wanted to explain how Epictetus' philosophy gives us real advice on how to live well, and I think the best encapsulation of why this is the case comes in section 5 of the Enchiridion, where Epictetus says the following: Men are disturbed not by the things, but by the views which they take of things. So again, what disturbs us is not what happens in the world, whether, like Epictetus, you were born a slave, or whether you're extremely wealthy, or you get the job you want or you don't, or a horrible tragedy happens to your family, or everyone's prosperous. What disturbs you or makes you happy is not what things happen in the world. It's the view you take of those things. And so far we've been looking at this in terms of how you yourself should think about the tragedies that happen to you. But I want to put this another way as well, and look at another way in which Epictetus applies this principle. So in this passage he talks about sympathy and having sympathy for another person who suffered a tragedy. So here's what Epictetus says: When you see anyone weeping for grief, either that his son has gone abroad or that he has suffered in his affairs, take care not to be overcome by the apparent evil, but discriminate and be ready to say, what hurts this man is not this occurrence itself, for another man might not be hurt by it, but the view he chooses to take of it. So imagine someone is, extremely upset. Some tragedy, something very bad has happened to a family member of theirs. And suppose you are going to apply the Stoic philosophy to try to understand this situation. So the first thing you ask is, well, why is this individual so upset? What is troubling them so much? Now, based on the above statement, you would say it's not that this tragedy has happened to them. It's that they're taking the wrong view of things. If the Stoic philosophy is correct, then when you respond to this person, what you should keep in mind is what's really upsetting them is not the tragedy itself, but the value that they placed upon this family member or whatever it is else they value. According to the Stoic philosophy, what they should have done is learn to limit their desires and not be so attached to external goods they can't control. Now, imagine what it would really be like to respond to a person in that way. Imagine what it would be like to go up to someone and to say to them, I understand you're suffering greatly, but remember, this isn't actually a bad thing. He uses the phrase here, apparent evil. This only seems like something bad. The really bad thing here is that you're not viewing this properly. The bad thing here is that you've invested so much importance and so much value into the well-being of this family member. Now again, just as, to avoid feeling grief, as we said previously, would seem unhuman on your own account, to respond to a grieving person in this way would also seem just fundamentally inhuman, perhaps immoral. So what does Epictetus say you should do? He actually doesn't say you should directly say this to them. If you look at the passage, he says, as far as conversation goes, when you actually engage with this person, however, do not disdain to accommodate yourself to him, and if need be, to groan with him. So he says, look, you should be accommodating. You might even sympathetically, as he says, groan or express sorrow with them. But notice what he says at the very end here. Take heed, however, not to groan inwardly too. So should you show compassion and sympathy for this person who is suffering? Well, yes, as a matter of fact, you should in a sense, but only outwardly. Inwardly, you should not actually be feeling sympathy for this tragedy because, again, it's not the tragedy that's bad, it's the way they are looking at it. So not only does the way he describes sympathy seem somewhat inhuman, just somewhat lacking in compassion, but it says the way that you would express the sympathy you do express has a sort of false facade to it. It seems like you're sort of lying, right? Because on the inside, you're not really feeling sympathetic. You're just going along with how they're feeling in that moment. And so again, I think this is another place where the Stoic philosophy of Epictetus seems to really cut off real human connection in ways that might make us wonder, does this give us a meaningful way to live our lives? In any case, we can derive what I will call the Stoic Principle of well-being. So this is an overall description of, for a Stoic, how you ought to live your life, and the way to ensure that you're happy and flourishing. So I think this is probably the best expression of it, coming from section 8 of the Enchiridion. Demand not that events should happen as you wish, but wish them to happen as they do happen, and you will go on well. So what is he saying here? Well, notice that when we think about the future, when we think about what we want to have happen, as human beings, we have many abilities and faculties, but one of those is the imagination. And so when, you're going to a job interview and you're imagining all the different possible outcomes that could happen, when you meet someone for the first time, you imagine all the possible outcomes that could come from this relationship, etc., etc. The mind has an ability to imagine all sorts of different scenarios. And I think one way to make this point is to imagine something you're really looking forward to. So, let's say you have a vacation coming up, and, you've been working a lot, you've been sort of, you need a break, right? So you plan this vacation, you spend months planning it. Let's say you're going to Hawaii, you're going to hang out on the beach, it's great. So there's all this buildup. You imagine all the possible outcomes that could occur. And one of the things that's interesting with things we really want to happen, that we have anticipation for, is we usually imagine the best possible outcome, right? So you imagine yourself there on the beach. It's all very peaceful, right? You're reading. Maybe you also do some hiking, go to eat at nice restaurants. You imagine like all the really desirable and best aspects of that experience. And one of the dangerous things there is that when you do that with something you're really anticipating and looking forward to, you fixate on that outcome as the sort of criteria of success. This is, after all, why you want to go on the vacation. So if that doesn't happen, then it seems like the vacation was a failure. So we have a tendency to imagine many different possible outcomes, and if it's something we're really looking forward to, in this particular example, focus on the best possible outcome and imagine that and run through our mind and build our anticipation. But of course, when it actually comes time for the vacation to occur, the best possible outcome will not happen, right? There's going to be, you're at the airport and the flight's delayed, so you're sitting in the airport, then they lose your luggage and you only get it a few days later. You do have a good time on the beach, but one of the restaurants you go to, the waiter or waitress was kind of mean to you, and the service wasn't great. One day it's raining, so some of your activities that you had planned are ruined, right? And not to say it's going to be a bad vacation, but nothing ever happens perfectly. And this just is a sort of, what the Stoics ultimately want to get across is that this is ultimately the cause of all our disturbance. This is ultimately the cause which prevents us from attaining mental tranquility, which causes anxiety, which causes sadness, which causes grief, which causes us to be troubled. And so here's what the Stoics say you should do. All these possible outcomes that could occur, that your imagination gets carried away in, be indifferent to those. If the best thing happens, awesome, welcome that in, that's great. But recognize the worst could happen too, and be indifferent to which one of those happens. Instead, you shouldn't desire any of the possible outcomes. What you should do is train yourself, and at various parts in the Enchiridion, Epictetus explains how this does actually take training. But what you should do is train yourself to desire not what could happen, but what does actually happen. The actual outcome is what you should in fact desire. As he says again in the passage, demand not that events should happen as you wish them to happen as they do happen, and that is how you will go on well. And like I said, while I've had some critiques of Stoicism in this video, I think when taken too far, it can give us a picture of human life that is not necessarily attractive or desirable. I think there is real wisdom there. I think learning to accept things the way they are, learning to accept various outcomes and take some of your identity out of things going a certain way, I think can in fact go a long way toward lessening your dependence on external events and becoming a more free and flourishing individual. Okay, so I will stop there. Thank you for listening. I hope this video was useful, and I will see you next time.